Hello and welcome to our fireside, where every story feels like a conversation over a warm cup of coffee. Pull your chair closer. The wind is howling tonight and the snow lies thick upon the streets of London. What you are about to hear is one of the strangest and most terrible cases in which I ever knew Sherlock Holmes to be engaged. Chapter 1. The Frostbound Visitor. Hello and welcome to our fireside, where every story feels like a conversation over a warm cup of coffee. Pull your chair closer to the hearth, my friend. The wind is howling tonight like a lost soul on the moor, and the snow lies so thick upon the streets of London that even the gas lamps seem to shiver in their glass cages. What you are about to hear is one of the strangest and most terrible cases in which I ever knew Sherlock Holmes to be engaged. A case that began on a night when the very air seemed to conspire against the living and ended in revelations that still, after all these years, make my blood run colder than the wind that rattles these old windows. It was the 22nd of December, 1888, a date I shall never forget, for it fell in the hardest winter any Londoner then living could recall. The great frost had begun in November, and by mid-December the Thames itself had begun to freeze along the edges, while the narrower canals were solid enough for boys to skate upon. Coal smoke hung low over the rooftops, mingling with the driving snow until the whole city seemed smothered beneath a gray-white shroud. Hansom cabs crawled through the streets like black beetles on a white tablecloth, their drivers muffled to the eyes, and even the hardy costermongers had forsaken their barrows for the warmth of the public-house fire. In our old rooms at 221B Baker Street, however, we were snug enough. A noble fire roared in the grate, fed with the best Newcastle coal that Mrs. Hudson could procure, and the familiar clutter of Holmes's possessions lay about us in comfortable disorder. The unanswered correspondence transfixed by a jackknife to the mantel, the chemical apparatus bubbling gently in the corner, the Persian slipper stuffed with shag tobacco, and the violin lying carelessly across a pile of yesterday's newspapers. Holmes himself was sprawled in his armchair in the mouse-colored dressing gown he affected when indoors, his long legs stretched toward the blaze, his thin fingers steepled beneath his chin. He had been silent for over an hour, his keen gray eyes half closed, his hawk-like face lit orange by the flames. I knew the signs. He was in one of his black moods, when the cocaine bottle tempted, and the criminal classes of London seemed to have taken a holiday. I had been reading, or attempting to read thus, the latest number of the Lancet, but my attention kept wandering to the window, where the snowflakes whirled past the glass in mad, endless dances. The wind moaned in the chimney like a mourning woman, and every so often a gust would hurl a handful of snow against the panes with a sound uncannily like desperate fingers scrabbling for admittance. "Really, Holmes," I said at last, laying the journal aside, "this weather would drive a man to distraction. 3 days now without a case worthy of the name. Even Lestrade has not darkened our door." Holmes gave a short, mirthless laugh. "My dear Watson, you mistake ennui for inactivity. The fire is pleasant, the tobacco is strong, and the cocaine—" He gestured languidly toward the morocco case on the mantel. "Remains untouched. What more can a reasonable man ask of Christmas week?" Before I could reply, there came a sudden furious ringing at the street doorbell, 3 short, impatient pulls that spoke of a man at the end of his tether. We heard Mrs. Hudson's measured tread in the hall, then the low murmur of voices, one calm and maternal, the other hoarse with urgency and cold. A moment later, our landlady appeared in the doorway, her kindly face flushed from the stairs. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes," she said. "A Mr. Frost, Mr. Elias Frost. He says the matter is most urgent, and indeed he looks half dead with cold and fear. Shall I show him up?" Holmes's eyes snapped open, bright as a ferret's. "Frost, you say? By all means, Mrs. Hudson, and quickly. The name is seasonal. She disappeared and we heard heavy, uneven footsteps ascending. Then the door opened fully and there entered a man who seemed to bring the very spirit of the blizzard in with him. He was tall, over 6 feet, but so gaunt that he appeared almost skeletal beneath his greatcoat. His face was as white as the snow on his shoulders, save where the cold had burned 2 feverish spots of red on his cheekbones. A heavy beard and mustache, rimed with ice, framed a mouth that trembled uncontrollably. His eyes, pale blue, bloodshot, darted about the room as though expecting to see some horror lurking in the shadows. Snow melted from his boots in little puddles on our carpet, and his gloved hands shook so violently that he could scarcely remove his hat. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked in a voice that cracked like breaking ice. Holmes rose with that swift cat-like grace that always surprised those who judged him merely thin and languid. "The same. This is my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson. Pray take the basket chair by the fire, Mr. Frost. Mrs. Hudson will bring brandy." Our visitor collapsed rather than sat, holding his frozen hands to the blaze as though he would never be warm again. I noticed that the cuffs of his coat were soaked with melted snow up to the elbows, and his boots, expensive Russian leather, were caked with it to the ankles. Mrs. Hudson bustled in with a tray. Brandy, hot water, sugar, lemon. Holmes himself mixed a stiff glass and pressed it into the man's hands. "Drink," he commanded. "All of it. Then when you can speak without your teeth chattering, tell us why a gentleman of obvious means presents himself at Baker Street on a night when even the thieves are by their own firesides." Mr. Elias Frost drank obediently, coughed as the spirit burned its way down, then drank again. Color began to return to his face, and the terrible shaking gradually subsided. When he spoke at last, his voice was still hoarse but steady. "Mr. Holmes," he began, "I am a wealthy man, a banker in the city, and I have never before had cause to seek the services of a private consulting detective. But what has happened? What has happened is impossible. The police, Inspector Lestrade, a ferret-faced little man, says it is impossible. Yet my brother lies dead in the morgue at Marylebone, and the snow around his body is untouched except for his own footprints." Holmes leaned forward, his whole aspect changed. The languor had vanished. Here was the hunter scenting blood. "Pray continue, Mr. Frost," he said softly. "Every detail, however trivial it may seem to you. Begin with your brother's name and occupation." "Nathaniel Frost, my younger brother by 3 years. 47 years of age. A bachelor like myself. We were partners in Frost Brothers Bank in Lombard Street. A brilliant man, Mr. Holmes, perhaps too brilliant. For some years he had withdrawn, secretive. He kept a private laboratory in a house on Erebus Lane, Blackfriars, a place he would allow no one to enter, not even me." "And this morning?" Holmes prompted. "This morning, or rather yesterday morning now, a park keeper found him in Regent's Park, at dawn, lying on his back in the middle of a wide expanse of untouched snow. His throat—" Here Mr. Frost's voice failed entirely, and he buried his face in his hands. "His throat," Holmes finished gently, "was torn out, as though by the teeth and claws of some enormous beast. Yet when the police arrived, the snow for 30 yards in every direction was virgin white, save for a single line of footprints, your brother's own, leading to the body, and none leading away." Our visitor stared at Holmes in astonishment and growing horror. "How could you possibly know that?" Holmes waved the question aside. "The configuration is classic, though the details vary. Pray continue. What time did your brother leave home the previous evening?" "He did not come home. He often worked late at the laboratory. When he did not appear for dinner, I thought nothing of it. He had his own key to the Erebus Lane, but when breakfast came and went with no word, I telephoned the laboratory, no answer. Then the police arrived at my house in Kensington with the news. "Describe the wound exactly," Mr. Frost shuddered. "Like nothing human. The throat was savaged, the carotid artery severed completely. Great gouges in the flesh as though made by talons. The snow beneath him was soaked crimson for yards around. Yet no blood trail, no sign of any struggle except where he fell. And those footprints—" He broke off, draining the last of the brandy. Holmes had risen and was pacing the room in that restless way of his dressing gown flying behind him like wings. "One more question, Mr. Frost. Your brother's boots, were they of Russian manufacture?" Our visitor stared. "Why, yes. He affected them, said they were the only things that kept his feet warm in winter." Holmes spun on his heel, his eyes blazing with that fierce excitement I knew so well. "Watson," he cried, "the game is afoot, and a very pretty little problem it is, too. Mr. Frost, you have done us a great service in coming here tonight. Return to your home now and try to rest. Dr. Watson and I will visit the scene at first light. The snow will have preserved everything beautifully." When our half-frozen visitor had departed, wrapped in one of my old ulsters and conveyed home in the only growler we could find, Holmes flung himself back into his chair and reached for his oldest briar pipe. "Well, Watson," he asked, his eyes dancing, "what do you make of it?" "A madman," I said promptly. "Some lunatic who approached through the air. Balloon, perhaps, or on stilts." Holmes chuckled. "My dear doctor, when did you last see a balloon abroad in London during a blizzard? And stilts would leave characteristic holes. No, no. The solution lies elsewhere. But what a case, Watson. Murder by impossible means in the middle of Regent's Park with half of London buried under snow. The police will make nothing of it. Lestrade is already talking of werewolves and foreign anarchists." He puffed silently for a while, staring into the fire. "Mark my words, Watson," he said at last. "Before this is over, we shall have cause to regret the day Nathaniel Frost decided to play God in his private laboratory. There are doors, my friend, that science opens at its peril. And I very much fear that your countryman's talent for opening such doors has rarely been more recklessly employed." Outside, the snow continued to fall, thick and silent and implacable, covering London like a winding sheet. And in our warm sitting room, with the fire crackling and the wind moaning, I felt for the first time the cold breath of something ancient and terrible stirring beneath the familiar streets of our great city. Little did I know how deep that darkness ran, nor how close it would come to claiming us both before the end. Chapter 2. The Body in the Snow. The morning of the 23rd broke dull and iron gray, with a sky so low it seemed to press upon the rooftops like a lid. Snow still fell still, but softly now, fat, lazy flakes that drifted rather than drove, settling on every ledge and sill until London looked like a city built of wedding cake left out in the cold. I had passed a restless night, my dreams haunted by pale faces and blood upon snow, and when Holmes shook me awake at half an hour before dawn, I rose without complaint. He was already dressed in his long mouse-gray ulster and ear-flap traveling cap, his eyes bright with that fierce energy that always seized him at the beginning of a new hunt. "Come, Watson," he cried, flinging my greatcoat at me. "The snow will have preserved everything to perfection. If we are quick, we shall have the scene to ourselves before Lestrade and his bulls trample it into slush." We found a growler on the rank at Baker Street, the driver half frozen on his box and glad of our double fare, and rattled north through streets that were almost deserted. Only the scavengers and the milk carts were abroad, and the muffled clop of our horses' hooves sounded unnaturally loud in the muffled city. Regent's Park lay under a white pall, the trees stripped to black skeletons against the snow. A thin cordon of constables kept back a small knot of early idlers, newspapermen mostly sniffing for a Christmas sensation. Inspector Lestrade emerged from the gloom as we approached, his sharp ferret face crimson with cold, his bowler hat white with snow. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he greeted us with that mixture of resentment and relief the official police always showed when my friend appeared. "I thought you might turn up. Though what you expect to make of this devilry I can't imagine." "Show me the body, Lestrade," Holmes said simply. The little inspector led us across the snow, his boots crunching. The footprints of the constables had already marred the edges of the scene, but the central expanse remained untouched. A wide, smooth sheet of white broken only by one thin, dark line that led from the Marylebone Road gate straight to where the dead man lay. I shall never forget the sight. Nathaniel Frost lay on his back in the middle of that virgin field, his arms flung wide as though he had fallen from a great height, or as though he were making a snow angel in some ghastly jest. His fur-lined greatcoat was flung open, his scarf had been torn away. The throat, God forgive me, the throat was a red ruin. The wound began just below the left ear and traveled across to the right jaw in a savage arc, deep enough that I could see the white gleam of bone and cartilage. Blood had poured out in a great fan across the snow, already frozen to blackish crimson crystals that glittered in the dawn light like rubies on a corpse's breast. Yet around the body for 30 yards in every direction the snow was smooth and unmarked, save for that single line of footprints approaching, deep, deliberate impressions that ended 10 feet from the corpse, as though the man had taken wings the last few paces and flown to his death. Holmes dropped to his hands and knees without ceremony, utterly heedless of the cold that struck up through his trousers. He produced his lens and began to crawl along the line of prints, examining each one with minute care. "Russian boots," he murmured almost to himself. "Handmade in St. Petersburg. Note the distinctive pattern of the nails and the slight curve of the toe. Expensive. The left heel is worn more on the outer edge, an old cavalry habit, riding with the toe down. The stride is long, 31 inches, but the depth of impression varies. Here deeper, here shallower, suggesting the walker was carrying something heavy at the start of his journey and set it down before the end. He reached the point where the prince stopped and lay flat on his belly, lens inches from the snow. Remarkable, he breathed. The last print is deeper than any other. The toe heavily marked, heel scarcely at all. As though the man launched himself forward with great force. Yet there is no corresponding disturbance in the snow ahead. Lestrade snorted. Launched himself? He'd need to be a blooming kangaroo, Mr. Holmes. No, sir. This is something worse than any natural murderer. The newspapers are already calling it the Regent's Park vampire. Mark my words, we'll have half London in hysterics by nightfall. Holmes rose, brushing snow from his coat with a gesture of impatience. Vampires, Lestrade? Really? I expected better from Scotland Yard, even in Christmas week. He began to circle the body slowly, his eyes taking in every detail. I followed, though the sight turned my stomach. The dead man's face was not peaceful. The eyes were wide, the mouth contorted in a grimace of ultimate terror. Frost, literally a crater had formed on his beard and eyelashes. One gloved hand still clutched a small object. Holmes gently pried it free. A key, he said. Yale pattern, newly cut. And look, frozen to the palm is a scrap of paper. Watson, your eyes are better than mine in this light. I took the fragment carefully. It was part of a laboratory label, the ink already running where blood had soaked it. Periment 47, reanimation, heart from St. Bart's, Smith. The rest was illegible. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Lestrade, he said sharply, Have this body conveyed with all care to St. Bartholomew's. I shall want to examine it myself this afternoon, and preserve these footprints. Cover them with boxes if you must. They are evidence of the highest importance." The inspector shrugged. "As you say, Mr. Holmes, though I don't see what good it'll do. There's no man living could have done this, not and left no trace." Holmes smiled thinly. "On the contrary, Lestrade, there is one man living who did this, or rather who was here. The question is, how did he leave?" He stood a moment longer, gazing out across the white expanse toward the frozen lake that glimmered dimly through the trees. The wind stirred the snow into little eddies around our feet, and somewhere a crow cawed harshly, a sound like mocking laughter. "Come, Watson," Holmes said at last, "there is nothing more to be learned here until the thaw, which I trust will not come too soon. Let us return to Baker Street. I have telegrams to send and certain inquiries to make regarding Russian boots and gentlemen who ride with their toes down." As our growler carried us back through the silent streets, I glanced at my companion. His face was pale and set, his eyes fixed on some inward vision. "Holmes," I ventured, "you have a theory already?" He turned to me with that sudden bright smile that always startled me. "Several, Watson, all of them absurd, but one perhaps less absurd than the rest. Tell me, have you ever considered how very silent deep snow is? Sound carries strangely in it, and a man on runners, sledge runners let us say, might travel faster and farther than any walker, and leave no print at all upon a frozen surface." He relapsed into silence, his thin fingers drumming upon his knee. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the tracks, hiding secrets, preparing London for Christmas. But in Sherlock Holmes's eyes burned a light that had nothing of seasonal goodwill about it. It was the light of the hunter who has scented his quarry, and knows that the quarry is dangerous beyond any he has hunted before. Chapter 3. Footprints that Vanish. We returned to Baker Street through streets that had become treacherous with half-frozen slush, the growler's wheels skidding alarmingly at every corner. The short winter day was already dying. The gas lamps were being lit, their flames hissing in the damp air, casting trembling circles of orange light upon the snow. I was chilled to the bone, not merely by the weather, but by the memory of that savaged throat and those impossible footprints. Holmes, however, was in the highest spirits, his cheeks whipped red by the wind, eyes glittering like polished steel. Mrs. Hudson had a fresh pot of coffee and a plate of muffins waiting. Bless her foresight. But Holmes waved them aside and flung himself into his armchair, reaching immediately for the cherry-wood pipe he reserved for problems of exceptional depth. For a long while he smoked in silence, the blue clouds curling toward the ceiling, his brows knitted in furious thought. I knew better than to interrupt. I contented myself with hot coffee and the Morning Post, though I confess I saw not a word of the print. At length he spoke, his voice sharp with excitement. "Consider the problem, Watson. A man walks alone into the center of a snow-covered field. He is attacked and killed with savage violence. The carotid severed great gouges in the flesh as though made by talons or teeth. Yet no other human being approaches within 30 yards. The snow is virgin, the footprints only his own, arriving but never departing. How was it done?" I laid the newspaper aside. "I have been considering little else. The murderer must have approached by air, a balloon perhaps, or some form of glider." Holmes gave a short, contemptuous laugh. "In a London blizzard, with wind gusting to 30 knots? No balloonist living would attempt such a descent, and a glider would leave unmistakable furrows where it landed. Besides, how would our assassin ascend again carrying the weight of blood upon him? No, no, Watson. The solution lies closer to the ground. He sprang up and began pacing the familiar tigerish pacing, 4 steps to the window, 4 steps back, his dressing gown flapping. "Eliminate the impossible," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "Whatever remains, however improbable." The wound was unquestionably made by a living agency. The tearing is irregular, savage, not the clean cut of a blade. Yet no living man could have reached the victim without leaving traces. Therefore, he stopped dead, staring at the fire. Therefore, the murderer did leave traces, but traces we have not yet recognized because they are not footprints. I stared at him. Not footprints? Then what? A sharp rapping at the street door interrupted me. Billy the page boy entered with a telegram on a salver. Holmes snatched it, tore it open, and his thin lips curved in a smile that was almost feral. "From Wiggins," he said. "The keys to the Erebus Lane house are in my possession." The boy picked them from the brother's pocket at the morgue. "Capital lad." He tossed the flimsy sheet across to me. It read, "Keys obtained, stop laboratory, sealed by police, but back door lock simple, stop address 13. Erebus Lane, Blackfriars, stop waiting instructions, stop." Wiggins Holmes was already at the bookshelf, pulling down volumes of the chemical news for the past 5 years. Nathaniel Frost was no ordinary banker, Watson. For 7 years he has been publishing, under the pseudonym NF, a series of papers on the electrical stimulation of cardiac tissue. The last, 18 months ago, was entitled "On the Possibility of Temporary Suspension and Subsequent Revival of Vital Processes in Mammalian Hearts Excised Post-Mortem." He slammed the volume shut. Our victim was attempting nothing less than the conquest of death itself, and I very much fear he succeeded, partially at least. I felt the hairs rise on my neck. "You cannot mean." "I mean precisely what I say. The wound is consistent with attack by a creature of great strength but imperfect coordination. Claws, perhaps, or surgical instruments wielded by hands no longer entirely under control. The footprints cease because the attacker did not walk upon the snow at all." He whirled to the window, flinging it open. A blast of icy air swept in, swirling snowflakes across the carpet. "Listen. Do you hear how muffled all sound is? Deep snow deadens everything, but certain surfaces, very hard, very smooth surfaces, would support weight without breaking through. The lake in Regent's Park, Watson, it has been frozen for a week. A man on skates, or better yet on a light sledge." He broke off, staring out into the whirling darkness. "But the lake is not yet safe. The ice is thin in places, warnings posted everywhere. No, that cannot be." Yet even as he spoke, I saw the idea take root. He closed the window and resumed pacing, faster now. "Suppose the murderer came across the lake on runners, not skates, but a proper Norwegian sledge, low and swift. He strikes, returns the same way. The ice supports him perfectly, leaves no trace in the snow beyond. But why stop 10 feet from the body? Why not all the way?" He answered himself almost immediately. "Because the ice ends. There is a broad margin of snow between the lake and the open ground where the body lay. The murderer must have leapt the last few yards, hence the deep toe mark in the final print, struck like a thunderbolt and leapt back before the victim could even cry out." I could not repress a shiver. But the strength required, the coordination, it would be superhuman. "Precisely," Holmes said softly. "Superhuman, or perhaps posthumous." The room seemed to grow colder. Outside, the wind howled like something alive and hungry. Holmes suddenly clapped his hands together. "We must see that laboratory, Watson, tonight if possible. I have a feeling that Nathaniel Frost's secrets did not die with him." He rang for Mrs. Hudson and ordered a cab for 9 o'clock, then spent the intervening hours in a perfect frenzy of activity. Telegrams dispatched, chemical apparatus set bubbling, maps of Regent's Park spread across the table. I watched him with the old familiar mixture of admiration and apprehension. When Sherlock Holmes scented his quarry, ordinary considerations of danger or fatigue meant nothing. At 8:30 we set out, muffled to the eyes. The snow had ceased, but the cold was more bitter than ever. The stars glittered like chips of ice in a black sky. Erebus Lane proved to be a narrow, evil-smelling alley behind Blackfriars Station, lined with decaying warehouses and one solitary Georgian house, its windows shuttered and blind. Number 13. Holmes produced the stolen keys. The lock turned with a rusty shriek that echoed down the empty street. We stepped inside, closing the door quickly against the night. The air within was frigid, heavy with the smells of formaldehyde and ozone. Holmes struck a match, and in its flare I saw a long hallway, doors on either side, and at the far end a heavier door reinforced with iron. The laboratory. Even before we reached it, I knew we were not alone. There was a sound, faint, rhythmic, like the slow beating of a wounded heart, coming from beyond that iron-bound door. Holmes's face, lit by the match's glow, was pale and terrible. "Whatever Nathaniel Frost awakened," he whispered, "it is still awake." He fitted the largest key into the lock. The door swung open with a groan, and from the darkness within came a low, guttural growl that was not human at all. Chapter 4. The House on Erebus Lane. The growl that greeted us as the iron-bound door swung open was low and guttural, more beast than human, a sound that seemed to rise from the very throat of the earth itself. My heart hammered against my ribs. My hand went instinctively to the revolver in my coat pocket. Holmes, however, showed no hesitation. He struck another match, cupping the flame with his gloved palm, and stepped across the threshold. The laboratory was plunged in Stygian darkness, the air so cold it burned the lungs. Our breaths plumed white before us. The match flared, revealing a long, narrow room lined with shelves of bottles and jars, their labels peeling like dead skin. In the center stood a massive glass tank, taller than a man and twice as broad, filled with a cloudy, milky fluid that swirled sluggishly as though something had only just been disturbed. The growl came again, closer now, from the far corner. Holmes advanced, the match held high. I followed, pistol drawn. The flame guttered in a sudden draft, then steadied, and we saw it. A huge husky chained to an iron ring in the wall, its fur white as the snow outside, its eyes glowing red in the matchlight. The beast strained against its collar, lips drawn back from yellow fangs, but the chain held. "One of the sledge dogs," Holmes murmured, relief and excitement mingled in his voice. "Magnificent animal. Siberian, I should say. See how the ears are pricked, the tail curled but half-starved. Note the ribs. Our late friend kept more than chemical secrets here." He knelt, extending his hand slowly. The dog sniffed, then whined and licked his fingers. Holmes scratched its throat with genuine affection. "There, there, old fellow, you shall have meat before the night is out." He rose and lit the gas jets along the wall. Harsh white light flooded the chamber, revealing a scene of scientific madness such as I had never imagined, even in the fever dreams of my Afghan nights. The place was a chaos of apparatus, galvanic batteries the size of beer barrels, their terminals crusted with blue-green corrosion, retorts and alembics bubbling over spirit lamps, though no hand had tended them for days. A surgical table stained dark with old blood, and everywhere the sharp, sweet stench of formaldehyde mingled with something else, something metallic and vital that made my stomach turn. In one corner stood the sledge, a low Norwegian pulk, its runners gleaming with fresh wax, the leather harnesses still attached. 6 chains led from it to rings in the floor where the other dogs had evidently been kept. Only this one remained, Holmes went to it immediately, running his hands along the runners with almost sensual appreciation. Note the construction, Watson. Light ash wood, iron shod, built for speed across hard snow or ice. These scratches here, fresh, made within the last 48 hours. And look, he pointed to a dark stain on the forward thwart. Blood. Still slightly tacky, not fully frozen. He straightened, eyes blazing. The murderer came by sledge, Watson. Across the frozen lake. The ice is thin, yes, but a light sledge drawn by 6 strong dogs could skim across it like a skater distributing the weight. The final leap from the ice margin to the snow, 10 feet, perhaps 12, accounts for the abrupt cessation of the footprints. The deep toe mark was the spring, the lighter heel, the takeoff. But the lake is posted dangerous, I protested. Warnings everywhere. Exactly, Holmes said grimly. Which makes our murderer either desperate or something that no longer fears death because it has already experienced it. He turned to the great glass tank. The fluid within was murky, but I could make out a shape suspended in it. Large, man-shaped, the limbs floating gently as though in some obscene womb. Holmes found a valve and twisted it. Pumps wheezed. The fluid began to drain with a gurgling sound. As the level fell, the shape became clearer. A human body, naked, the chest open like a book and sewn crudely together again with black thread. The face was turned away, but the hair floating like seaweed. When the last of the fluid had drained, Holmes reached in and gently turned the head. It was Nathaniel Frost. Or what had been Nathaniel Frost. The eyes were open, filmed with death, but the expression was not peaceful. It was one of agony and terrible purpose. "Good God," I whispered. Holmes was already at the desk, flipping through a thick ledger bound in red morocco. His voice, when he spoke, was strangely hushed. "Listen to this, Watson. 3rd December, experiment 47 failed. Subject, canine, expired after 14 minutes of revived animation. Muscular spasms too violent. 10 December, acquired fresh human heart from St. Bartholomew's, grateful to Smith for his discretion. Porcine valve incompatible. 15th December, installed new galvanic array. Current increased to 400 volts. Encouraging fibrillation in excised cardiac tissue. 18th December, first full attempt on human subject, self. Heart stopped at 11:47 p.m. Respiration ceased. Injected adrenaline solution directly to cardiac muscle. Revival at 11:52, now weak but undeniable. Consciousness returned after 8 minutes. Sensation in extremities poor. Skin temperature 31 degrees Celsius and falling. 20 December, the cold preserves. Have constructed refrigeration chamber using solid carbonic acid. Must maintain core temperature below 15 degrees or tissue decay accelerates. Craving for warmth becoming problematic. 24 December. Elias came today, suspects something. Must complete the work before he interferes. If this journal is found, tell my brother I did it for us both. That death should not part those who love. The last entry was in a different hand, shaky, almost illegible. He walks, but he is not himself. The dogs fear him. I have chained the leader, but the others fled into the snow. God forgive me, I have created something that should not be. Holmes closed the book softly. Nathaniel Frost did not die in Regent's Park, Watson. He died here, on his own operating table, and was brought back, partially, imperfectly. The thing that attacked Elias was Nathaniel himself, driven by a body that craves heat as a drowning man craves air. The sledge was his means of travel across the ice. Swift, silent, leaving no trace in snow. I stared at the suspended corpse. Then this is an earlier subject, Holmes said. Or perhaps a later one. The sewing is different, cruder. No, Nathaniel lives still, if living it can be called. and he is out there in the snow tonight seeking the warmth he can never truly regain. He moved to a cabinet and opened it. Inside, nestled in cotton wool, were glass vials of a white crystalline substance that smoked gently in the cold air. "Dry ice," Holmes said. "Solid carbon dioxide." Frost was manufacturing it in quantity, enough to turn this entire house into a sepulcher. See the vents in the ceiling? He was trying to freeze himself alive to arrest decay until science could perfect the revival. He looked around the laboratory one last time, and I saw something almost like pity in his eyes. Hubris, Watson, the old Greek sin. To snatch fire from the gods is one thing. To steal the keys of death itself is quite another. Outside, the wind had risen again, rattling the shutters like bones in a box. Somewhere in the distance, a dog howled, long, mournful, and very far away. Holmes extinguished the gas jets one by one. "Come," he said. "We have seen enough. The hunter has become the hunted, and the quarry is abroad in London tonight." As we stepped back into Erebus Lane, locking the door behind us, the snow had begun to fall again. Thick, silent flakes that covered our footprints almost before we made them. But I knew that somewhere out there in the white darkness, something else was moving that left no prints at all. Chapter 5. The Three Suspects. London lay under a sky the color of old pewter, and the snow had turned to a fine, dry powder that danced like diamond dust in the wind. Holmes and I had not slept. The horrors of Erebus Lane still clung to us like the smell of formaldehyde. Yet by 10 o'clock that morning we were abroad again. For Holmes had determined that if Nathaniel Frost yet walked, someone in London must have helped him walk. He had spent the small hours compiling a list from the Red Morocco Ledger and certain discreet inquiries among the night porters of St. Bartholomew's. 3 names stood out. 3 people who had held keys to number 13 Erebus Lane. 3 people who had visited the laboratory in the last fortnight. We would see them all before the day was out. The first was the dead man's niece, or rather Elias Frost's niece. Miss Lavinia Frost, aged 24, sole heiress to the banking fortune now that both uncles were indisposed. She received us in the frost blue drawing room of the house in Kensington Gore, a room so overheated after the bitter streets that the windows dripped with condensation. Miss Frost was beautiful in the way a marble statue is beautiful, cold, perfect, and rather terrible. Her mourning was new and immaculate, black silk that rustled like serpents, black gloves, a black veil lifted just enough to reveal eyes the pale gray of winter skies. "Mr. Holmes," she said, voice clear and musical, "I have read of you. I confess I expected someone older." Holmes bowed slightly. "Disappointment is the common lot of those who meet me, Miss Frost. Pray accept my condolences and answer a few questions." She inclined her head. "You visited your Uncle Nathaniel at Erebus Lane on the 19th of December. Why?" A faint flush rose beneath the alabaster skin. "Uncle Nathaniel had promised me a Christmas gift, a necklace of sapphires. He was eccentric about such things. Insisted I come to the laboratory to receive it personally." "And did you receive it?" "No." He was distracted, feverish almost. He pressed the key into my hand, begged me to lock the door behind me when I left, and hurried back to his work. I thought him ill. Holmes's eyes never left her face. "You are aware, I suppose, that upon the death of both your uncles you inherit everything?" The pale eyes flashed. "I am aware that my uncles have been trying to kill each other for years, Mr. Holmes. Over money, over pride, over some secret neither would share with me. If one has finally succeeded, I shall not pretend to grief I do not feel." She rose, the silk whispering. "Now, if that is all—" "One more thing." Holmes produced a tiny object wrapped in tissue. He unfolded it, a single sapphire earring crusted with frozen blood. "This was found in the snow beside Elias Frost's body. The clasp is broken. Yours, I believe? For the first time, her composure cracked. The color drained from her cheeks. I lost it weeks ago. Curious, Holmes said softly. It matches the necklace your uncle promised you. Good day, Miss Frost. Our second call was in Bloomsbury at a lodging house that smelled of boiled cabbage and carbolic. Dr. Magnus Heller opened the door himself, a tall, stooping man with a mane of iron-gray hair and the palest blue eyes I have ever seen, almost colorless. A livid scar ran from his left temple to the corner of his mouth, relic of some student's duel in Vienna, I afterwards learned. Sherlock Holmes, he said in perfect English touched with a guttural accent. I have waited for you. He ushered us into a room that was half study, half laboratory. Shelves of German books, a human skull wired for electrical experiment, a cage containing 2 white rats with electrodes protruding from their shaved heads. You assisted Mr. Nathaniel Frost in certain researches, Holmes began. Heller smiled without warmth. I did more than assist. I inspired. In Vienna we were close, to the threshold, reviving drowned cats, executing criminals whose hearts beat again under the galvanic current. Frost had money. I had knowledge. Together we stepped across. And the result? The pale eyes gleamed. Magnificent. Terrifying. The body lives, but the soul, the soul is another matter. Frost wanted immortality, I warned him. What returns may not be the man who left. You were with him on the night of the 21st? I was. He induced clinical death at 11:47. I administered the injections, applied the current. At 11:55 the heart beat again, slowly, strongly. He opened his eyes and spoke my name. Then the craving began. He tore at the restraints. We had to sedate him with morphine and pack him in the carbonic snow. After that, Heller shrugged expressively. He dismissed me, said the work was now solitary. Holmes indicated the rats. And these? Control subjects. I continue the research. One day the world will thank us. Holmes's expression was wintry. One day the world may hang you both. Where were you yesterday morning, Dr. Heller? The Austrian smiled again. Walking in Regent's Park. The cold clears the mind. Alone? Entirely. Holmes nodded as though satisfied, but I saw the dangerous glitter in his eye. The last interview was the strangest. Jacob Grimes, caretaker and former Cossack, lived in a cellar off Cable Street, a warren of passages where the snow never reached. We found him sitting before a brazier, sharpening a short, curved saber. He was a giant of a man, bearded like the pard, but when he looked up I saw the terrible scar across his throat, white and puckered, the mark of a Tatar lance, no doubt. He could not speak. The lance had taken his voice. Instead, he communicated in grunts and gestures, writing on a slate when words were needed. Holmes wasted no time. You drove the sledge for Mr. Frost? A nod. You were with him the night he changed. Another nod, slower. And yesterday morning? Grimes hesitated, then wrote in laborious capitals. Hunted the master. He is not right any more. Holmes read it aloud, then asked gently, Will you hunt him again? The scarred throat worked. Grimes touched the saber, then wrote, Until one of us is dead. He looked at Holmes with eyes that had seen too much winter and too much blood, and for a moment I pitied him. As we left, Holmes paused on the threshold. Mr. Grimes, if you find him before I do, try not to kill him. There has been enough death. The Cossack merely touched his forehead in salute, soldier to soldier, and closed the door. In the hansom rattling back toward Baker Street, Holmes sat silent a long while, fingertips together. Well, Watson, he said at last, we have 3 suspects, each with motive, opportunity, and a fragment of the truth. Which of them is it then? Holmes smiled mirthlessly. None of them, Watson, and all of them. The truth is worse than any of them knows. But tonight, Christmas Eve, we shall lay the ghost or be laid by it. He leaned forward and gave the cabbie a new direction. Erebus Lane, and drive like the devil. The laboratory must be watched before darkness falls. Outside, the snow began again, thick and purposeful, as though London itself were trying to bury its secrets before they could be dug up. Chapter 6. The locked laboratory. The temperature had fallen so low that the very gas in the street lamps burned blue and feeble. Snow no longer fell. It hung suspended in the air like frozen dust, glittering whenever a rare hansom passed. London seemed to have drawn a white shroud over itself and gone to sleep, waiting for the plague to pass. Holmes and I reached Erebus Lane shortly after 9 o'clock. The cul-de-sac was deserted, the decaying houses blind and black. Number 13 stood apart, darker than the rest, its shutters closed like the eyelids of a corpse. Yet as we approached, I felt the skin crawl between my shoulder blades. The front door, which we had locked securely the night before, now stood ajar by the width of a hand. A thin blade of yellow light cut across the snow. Holmes put a finger to his lips and drew his revolver. I did the same. We moved forward in silence, boots crunching softly. Inside, the hall was no longer frigid. It was warm, unnaturally, oppressively warm. The laboratory door at the far end hung open, and from it poured a steady glow of gaslight and a low, continuous humming, as of powerful electrical machinery. We stepped over the threshold. The scene that met our eyes belonged in Bedlam or the pages of a German romance. The great glass tank had been drained and smashed. Shards lay everywhere, glittering like ice. The surgical table was overturned. Every jar, every retort had been swept from the shelves. In the center of the floor, a circle had been cleared, and within it stood a ring of blazing spirit lamps surrounding a mound of pale crystalline blocks. Dry ice, smoking furiously as it sublimed into white vapor that rolled across the floor in slow, cold waves. And in the midst of this freezing inferno crouched a figure. It had once been Nathaniel Frost. He knelt naked, skin blue-white and marbled with black veins, hair and beard grown long and matted with rime. His chest had been crudely reopened and re-sewn so many times that the stitches formed a hideous lattice. Tubes of rubber and glass protruded from his arms, connected to a crude galvanic battery that sparked and crackled. His eyes, once I presumed the mild eyes of a scholarly banker, now glowed with a dull red phosphorescence, like the eyes of certain deep-sea creatures. He was devouring something raw and steaming. The smell of fresh blood was unmistakable. At the sound of our footsteps, he raised his head and snarled, lips drawn back from teeth that seemed longer, sharper than any man's should be. Blood, dark, almost black, dripped from his chin. Holmes leveled his revolver. "Nathaniel Frost," he said calmly. "The experiment is over." The creature, for I can call it nothing else, tilted its head as though trying to remember language. A sound came from its throat, half sob, half growl. "Warm," it rasped. "Need warm." It rose unsteadily to its full height. The movement was wrong, jerking, hydraulic, as though the joints were operated by wires rather than muscle. The temperature in the room plummeted. Our breath smoked violently. Holmes fired once into the ceiling. Plaster rained down. "Stay where you are." The creature flinched from the noise, then took a shambling step forward. The ring of spirit lamps hissed where the cold vapor touched them but did not go out. I saw then what it had been eating. The last of the Siberian huskies, throat torn open, entrails steaming on the floorboards. The poor beast's eyes were still wide with terror. "Watson," Holmes said quietly, never taking his eyes from the thing. "The dry ice is his only restraint. If he breaks the circle, he will have the strength of 10 men. We must drive him back into cold. He began to edge sideways, forcing the creature to turn. I moved the other way. Slowly we herded it, as one might herd a dangerous bull, toward the shattered tank where remnants of the preserving fluid still dripped. The creature lunged. It was incredibly swift. One moment it was in the circle. The next it had crossed the ring of lamps, knocking 2 aside in blue explosions of flame, and was upon Holmes. I saw his revolver spin away across the floor. I fired twice. The bullets struck center mass. I saw them flatten against the breastbone and drop harmlessly to the boards. The thing did not even stagger. Holmes was borne backward against the wall with a crash that shook dust from the rafters. Frost's hands, hideously strong, fingers elongated and ending in broken nails like talons, closed around my friend's throat. I clubbed at the creature's head with my revolver barrel. The skin split, but no blood flowed, only a thick, icy fluid that smoked where it touched the air. The grip loosened for an instant. Holmes twisted free, gasping, and seized a long glass tube filled with the white crystals. He smashed it across the creature's face. Frost shrieked, a sound to shatter glass, and reeled backward, clawing at eyes suddenly blinded by freezing gas. "Now, Watson, the tank!" Together we drove the stumbling horror backward until its heels struck the low rim of the shattered tank. It windmilled, overbalanced, and fell with a crash into the remaining preservative fluid. The liquid hissed and boiled where the creature's unnatural heat touched it. Holmes snatched a heavy iron lid that had once covered the tank and slammed it down, wedging it with a crowbar he found among the debris. For a moment all was still save the frantic sparking of the battery and the hiss of evaporating dry ice. Then came a new sound. Heavy boots on the stairs, and the door burst open to reveal Jacob Grimes, the mute Cossack, saber in one hand, a coil of chain in the other. Behind him, pale but determined, stood Miss Lavinia Frost and Dr. Magnus Heller. Grimes took in the scene with one sweeping glance, crossed himself in the orthodox fashion, and advanced upon the tank. The lid was already bulging upward with each blow from within. Holmes raised a hand. "No, Grimes, not yet. We need him alive, if alive he still is." He turned to the newcomers. An unexpected delegation, I might almost say the entire dramatis personae assembled for the final act. "Miss Frost, your sapphire earring was indeed found beside Elias's body, but it was torn from your ear when your revived uncle mistook you for his brother in the darkness. You have been searching for him ever since, have you not?" She nodded, eyes fixed on the quivering lid. "Dr. Heller, your rats were useful, but the human experiment escaped your control the moment consciousness returned. You have been trying to recapture your specimen before the world learned what you had done." Heller said nothing, but his scar twitched. "And Grimes, loyal Grimes, you alone understood what your master had become. You have tracked him through the snow with your sledge and your dogs, trying to bring him home before he killed again." The Cossack inclined his great head. Holmes looked at each in turn. "Then we are agreed. The creature in that tank is no longer Nathaniel Frost, yet neither is he mere corpse. Until we decide what mercy or what justice demands, he remains here, restrained by cold. The laboratory will be sealed. No one enters without my authority." The lid of the tank gave another shuddering heave. From within came a voice, thin, pleading, almost human. "Elias, brother, let me out." So cold. Miss Frost turned away, sobbing into her glove. Holmes's face was granite. Cold is the only kindness left to him. He blew out the remaining lamps one by one until only the faint glow from the battery remained, painting our faces corpse blue. Outside, the bells of London began to ring for midnight mass, clear silver notes across the frozen city. Christmas Day had come, bringing no peace on earth and precious little goodwill toward men. Chapter 7. The Midnight Sledge. The temperature had fallen so low that the stars themselves seemed brittle. London lay silent under a moon as white and pitiless as a scalpel. No revelers staggered home. Even the thieves had crept to their hearths. The only sounds were the creak of frozen signboards and the occasional distant crack of ice on the river. Holmes had not rested. From the moment we left the sealed laboratory, he had been in motion. Telegrams to the Norwegian legation, a hurried conference with Lestrade, who had gone quite pale when shown the tank, and finally the commandeering of a fast ice sledge and 6 dogs from the legation stables. The beasts were enormous, wolf-gray, with the pale eyes of the Arctic. Their handler, a taciturn Laplander named Johansson, had simply bowed when Holmes explained what we hunted. Now at 20 minutes past midnight, we crouched in the deep shadow of the plane trees that bordered the frozen boating lake in Regent's Park. The sledge stood ready, runners waxed, harness muffled with rags. Holmes wore a long reindeer coat and a fur cap pulled low. I had borrowed an ulster lined with wolf. Both of us carried revolvers, and more importantly, Holmes had filled 2 large thermos flasks with boiling water and a third with burning brandy. So intense was the cold that metal itself became an enemy. The moon silvered the snow. Every breath we took hung in the air like a ghost. Holmes touched my arm and pointed. Far out on the lake, where the ice was black and glassy, a darker shape moved. Low, swift, almost soundless, a sledge drawn by 6 white dogs, their breath streaming behind them like banners. On the thwart stood a tall figure muffled in furs, one arm raised as though in command. Even at half a mile, there was no mistaking the set of those shoulders. Grimes. And ahead of him, loping across the moonlit snow with terrible purpose, ran the thing that had once been Nathaniel Frost. It moved on all 4s now, body low to the ground, impossibly fast, leaving no prints upon the frozen crust. The moonlight showed the livid scars across its back, the grotesque apparatus of wires and tubes that still clung to the torso like iron ivy. Holmes's whisper was the faintest thread of sound. He makes for the river. The ice is thicker there. If he reaches the open water beyond the bridge, he is lost to us. He sprang to our own sledge. Johansson cracked the short whip. The dogs surged forward with a deep-chested baying that rolled across the park like a war cry. We shot out onto the lake, runners hissing, spray of ice crystals flying up in glittering clouds. The chase was joined. Grimes had seen us. He turned his team in a wide arc, trying to head the creature off. For a moment, the 3 sledges formed a deadly triangle across the moonlit ice. Grimes in pursuit, ourselves closing from the flank, and ahead the shambling horror that had once been master of them all. Frost reached the margin where the lake narrowed into the long water. Here the ice was broken by pressure ridges, black cracks zigzagging like lightning. Without hesitation, the creature leapt them, landing with a force that sent shards spinning into the air. Grimes followed, his lighter sledge skimming the cracks like a stone skipped across a pond. Our own team faltered. Johansson shouted in Lapp, hauling on the reins. One runner struck a ridge and we slewed violently, almost capsizing. I was flung against the rail. The thermos of brandy burst, filling the air with the reek of alcohol and steam. Holmes was on his feet in an instant, steadying the sledge with one hand while the other pointed ahead. There, under the bridge. We shot beneath the ornamental bridge at Hyde Park Corner, iron girders flashing overhead. On the farther side, the ice broadened again into the Serpentine. Frost was making straight for Knightsbridge, where the river proper began. Beyond that lay the open Thames and freedom of a sort. Grimes was gaining. His white dogs ran like spirits of vengeance. He stood erect on the runners, one hand gripping the traces, the other raising something that caught the moonlight in a long, wicked gleam. An old Cossack lance, its blade newly sharpened. Holmes leant forward, shouting to Johansson above the wind. Cut him off at the Albert Gate. We take him alive if we can. The Laplander nodded grimly and lashed the team. Our sledge fairly flew. Ice chips stung our faces like shot. The world narrowed to the hiss of runners, the panting of dogs, the thunder of blood in my ears. We drew level with Grimes 100 yards short of the embankment. For a moment, the two sledges raced side by side, drivers staring across the narrow gap. Grimes's scarred throat worked. He raised the lance in salute or perhaps farewell. Then disaster. Ahead of us, the ice suddenly boomed, a deep, ominous crack that ran like a cannon shot from bank to bank. A pressure ridge had formed in the intense cold. The surface buckled upward in a jagged wall of blue-green ice fully 4 feet high. Frost leapt it without breaking stride. Grimes tried to follow. His sledge rose, hung for an instant, and came down wrong. One runner snapped clean through. The team tumbled in a tangle of traces and yelping bodies. Grimes was hurled forward, rolling across the ice, lance spinning away like a silver needle. Our own driver sawed desperately on the reins. We struck the ridge, a glancing blow, rose into the air and landed with a crash that flung Holmes and me clear. The sledge overturned, dogs howling, Johansson cursing in 3 languages. I came up half-stunned, revolver gone, snow in my mouth. 20 yards away, the creature that had been Nathaniel Frost had paused atop the ridge, head turning slowly as though scenting the wind. The moon lit its face, eyes glowing red, mouth open in a soundless scream of hunger. Holmes was already on his feet, coat torn, blood on his lip, but steady as ever. "Watson, the brandy flask." I found it miraculously unbroken, thrust it into his hand. He unscrewed the cap, poured a stream of blue flame onto a rag torn from his scarf, and touched a match to it. A torch roared into life. The creature saw the fire and recoiled with a shriek that split the night. It turned and fled toward the river embankment, where the ice sloped down to the black water of the Thames. Grimes was up, limping, lance recovered. He and Holmes exchanged one glance, perfect understanding between hunter and hunter, and together they ran in pursuit, the flaming torch held high. I followed as best I could, lungs burning with cold. We reached the river just as the adult creature scrambled out onto the broad expanse of the frozen Thames. Here the ice was thick, ridged and hummocked by the tide, safe enough for the coal barges that lay trapped at their wharves. The thing loped toward midstream, making for the Surrey side in darkness. Holmes hurled the torch. It spun end over end, a comet of blue fire, and landed squarely between the creature and escape. Frost screamed again, an inhuman, despairing sound, and veered away along the river, trapped between fire and the open water beyond Blackfriars. Grimes raised the lance. Holmes caught his arm. "Not yet!" He cupped his hands and shouted across the ice, voice carrying with astonishing clarity in the frozen air. "Nathaniel Frost, your brother waits. Turn back!" For a heartbeat, the creature paused, head cocked as though listening to a voice only it could hear. Then it threw back its head and gave a howl that brought watchmen running from the wharves with lanterns swinging. The hunt was not over. Farther downriver toward the dark bulk of Billingsgate, the ice began to groan again. The tide was turning even in this great cold. Black water showed in widening leads. And still the thing ran, and still we followed. 3 men and a burning brand against the horror science had loosed upon the night. Chapter 8. The Icehouse Revelation. The chase ended where the Thames itself seemed to conspire against us. Billingsgate Fish Market, silent and silver under the moon. The great ice houses of the Norwegian firms loomed along the wharf, windowless granite tombs built to store the winter catch from the North Sea. Their doors were plated with iron and sealed with padlocks the size of a man's fist. The creature that had been Nathaniel Frost ran straight for the largest of them, the one belonging to Messrs. Bergensfjord and Sons. The door stood ajar. Grimes is doing, no doubt, for he had tracked his master here before. Frost vanished inside like a wolf into its lair. Holmes's torch was burning low. He snatched a storm lantern from a startled night watchman and thrust it into my hands. "Follow, Watson. We have him now." Grimes was already at the door, lance raised. Holmes caught his sleeve. "Together, old soldier. No needless killing." The Cossack nodded once grimly. We stepped across the threshold. The cold inside struck like a physical blow. The air was so frigid that the lantern's flame shrank to a blue teardrop. Towering walls of Norwegian ice rose on every side, blocks taller than a man, clear as glass in places, cloudy with trapped air bubbles in others. They were stacked in aisles, forming a frozen labyrinth lit only by our lantern and the thin blade of moonlight that followed us through the door. Somewhere deep within, water dripped with the slow regularity of a dying clock. We moved forward in silence, boots crunching on sawdust and fish scales frozen to the floor. The cold was unearthly. My beard stiffened with frost in moments. Grimes signed that he would take the left aisle, Holmes the center, I the right. I had advanced perhaps 30 yards when I heard it, a low rhythmic sound almost like breathing. I raised the lantern. There, in a cleared space between two mountains of ice, hung Nathaniel Frost. He was suspended in a harness of chains and leather straps, swaying gently. Thick iron hooks passed through the flesh of his shoulders and thighs. Old surgical restraints, I realized, brought from Erebus Lane. Rubber tubes ran from his arms to glass bottles inverted in the ice above, dripping a slow, dark fluid, blood perhaps, or preservative. His head hung forward, chin on chest. The eyes were closed. For one terrible moment I thought him dead at last. Then the head came up. The eyes opened, glowing that same dull red, and fixed on me with recognition. "Doctor." The voice was a thread, yet it carried in the frozen stillness. "You were kind once. Tell Elias I never meant—" The words dissolved into a cough that brought black frost to his lips. Holmes appeared at my side, revolver drawn but lowered. "Speak, Frost," he commanded gently. "The truth now. All of it." The hanging man's head rolled. "Truth. There is only cold now, the heart. Heller gave me a new heart from the gallows. It beats, but slowly. So slowly I wake and sleep for weeks. The dogs. Grimes kept me alive with the dogs. Then Elias came to the park. I thought he was an angel, come to take me. I only embraced him." His ruined mouth twisted in what might once have been a smile. "Science promised mastery over death. It gave me apprenticeship to winter." Grimes stepped into the lantern light, face working with anguish. He raised one huge hand in a gesture that asked forgiveness or permission. Holmes shook his head. "No, Grimes. Not with steel. There has been enough iron in this man's flesh." He moved closer, studying the bottles, the tubes, the crude galvanic wires that still sparked faintly where they entered the chest. "Watson, the lancet in my pocket case. We end this properly." I handed it over, understanding. Holmes reached up and with the delicacy of a surgeon cut the rubber tubes one by one. Dark fluid ceased to drip. He then severed the wires. The sparks died. Finally, he unbuckled the leather straps. Frost's body sagged. Only the hooks through the shoulders now held him upright. "Listen to me, Nathaniel Frost," Holmes said, and his voice was steady, almost tender. "You sought to defy the oldest law. You have paid the price. But no man, not even you, need die unforgiven." He reached into his coat and drew out a small silver flask, the last of the burning brandy. He held it to the blue lips. Frost drank greedily, eyes closing in something that might have been peace. Color, faint, human color, returned to his cheeks for the first time. "Elias," he whispered, "tell my brother I kept the keys in the left." Drawer, forgive. The head fell forward. The glow in the eyes faded to darkness. Grimes stepped forward then and with infinite gentleness lifted the body from the hooks. He laid it on the sawdust floor and crossed the cold hands upon the breast. From his pocket he took a small icon, St. Nicholas, patron of the frozen north, and placed it between the fingers. Holmes stood a long moment in silence. Then he spoke, so softly I barely heard. Requiescat in pace, and may God have mercy on the soul of Victor Frankenstein, and on all who follow him. We left the ice house as we had found it, the door closed and padlocked from the outside. Grimes remained behind. He would see to the burial, he signed, in unconsecrated ground beyond the river where no questions would be asked. The Norwegians would be told a madman had broken in and frozen to death. A 5-pound note would ensure silence. As we walked back along the wharf, the sky was already paling toward Christmas dawn. The ice on the river gleamed rose and gold. Somewhere church bells began to ring, clear, joyous peals that seemed to belong to another world entirely. Holmes paused at the edge of the embankment and looked down at the frozen Thames. "Write it as you will, Watson," he said quietly, "but leave out the worst. The world is not ready to know how near it came to losing one of its oldest certainties. That death, at least, is final." He tossed the empty brandy flask into the snow. "Come, there's a cab rank at the bridge. Hot coffee and Mrs. Hudson's seed cake await the survivors." Behind us, the ice house stood silent, its secret locked in colder than any vault. And high above, the Christmas sun rose red and small, as though the day itself blushed for what men had dared beneath its predecessor's moon. Chapter 9. The Final Pursuit Across the Frozen Thames. The sun rose blood-red over the city but gave no warmth. The temperature had fallen again during the small hours. The very air seemed to burn the lungs. Along the Thames, the ice had thickened overnight, ridged and hummocked like a stormy sea frozen in mid-heave. Steam rose from the few open leads where the tide still fought the frost, and gulls wheeled above them, screaming like lost souls. Holmes and I stood on the embankment beside Billingsgate, staring at the ice-house door we had locked not 3 hours earlier. It hung open on broken hinges. The padlock lay in the snow, sheared clean through as though by giant shears. Grimes was gone. The body was gone. Holmes's face was terrible to see, pale as the snow itself, eyes blazing with a fury I had rarely witnessed. "We were fools, Watson," he said, voice raw. "We left the creature with the one man who loved him more than life. Grimes has taken his master home, to Erebus Lane or to hell itself." He was already moving, coat flapping like a crow's wing. I followed, heart hammering. We found the track at once. Broad sledge runners cutting across, the new snow, heading west along the river. The dogs had been worked cruelly, blood flecked the prints, and beside the runner marks, bare human feet splayed and monstrous, leaving smears of dark ice where they touched the snow. "They are making for the laboratory," Holmes cried, "when Grimes thinks the cold there can still preserve him." We ran. The embankment was treacherous. Black ice glazed the stones. Twice I fell, skinning my palms. Holmes never slackened. At London Bridge he vaulted into a waterman's skiff that lay frozen at its moorings, smashed the ice with the butt of his revolver, and pushed off with an oar. "Across the river, Watson. We cut them off at Blackfriars." I tumbled in beside him. The little boat groaned as we poled through the slush, the current sluggish but treacherous beneath the ice crust. On the far side, we scrambled up the muddy bank and raced westward along the Victoria embankment, boots slipping, breath smoking. The sledge tracks left the river at Blackfriars Bridge and turned into the warren of lanes behind the station. We could hear the dogs now, hoarse, exhausted barking, and above it a deeper sound, a rhythmic thudding like a great heart struggling to beat. Erebus Lane lay white and silent. Number 13 stood with its door flung wide, a black mouth in the snow. Inside, the laboratory was transformed. Every gas jet blazed. The shattered tank had been righted and filled, not with preservative, but with blocks of Norwegian ice hastily dragged in from the wharf. Steam rose where the creature's body heat met the freezing mass. Grimes had stripped to the waist despite the cold. His huge muscles gleamed with sweat and rime as he worked the chains of a crude hoist, lowering the body of Nathaniel Frost into the ice. The thing still lived. It lay on its back, chest heaving in slow, terrible spasms. The wounds in shoulder and thigh where the hooks had been torn free gaped black and bloodless. Tubes had been reconnected to bottles of dark fluid. Grimes must have carried them with him. A galvanic battery sparked and hummed, wires buried in the chest like iron roots. Frost's eyes opened, red, aware, and filled with an agony no human face should wear. "Jacob!" The voice was stronger now, resonant with the cold. "Finish it, or let me finish them." Grimes never paused. He was packing the ice around the body with frantic tenderness, as a mother might swaddle a dying child. Holmes stepped into the light, revolver leveled. "Enough, Grimes. The man you served is dead. What you keep alive is an abomination." The Cossack turned. His scarred throat worked. Tears had frozen on his cheeks. He wrote on the ever-present slate with a piece of charcoal, letters huge and shaking. "He saved my life at Sevastopol. I owe him this." Holmes shook his head. "You owe him peace." Behind Grimes, the ice began to hiss and steam with unnatural violence. Frost's body arched, the wires sparked blue. A low moan rose, building into a roar that rattled the very windows. The creature sat up. Ice cascaded from its shoulders. The chest cavity glowed faintly as though a furnace burned within. It looked at Holmes, at me, with eyes no longer human. "Warmth," it said, and the word carried all the hunger of the grave. Grimes moved to shield it, arms outstretched. The thing struck him aside with one sweep of its arm. The Cossack flew across the room, crashed into a shelf of bottles, and lay still among the shards. Then it came for us. Holmes fired. 3 shots, center mass. The bullet struck home but did not slow it. I saw them flatten and drop, smoking, to the floor. We backed toward the door. The creature advanced, each footstep cracking the frozen boards. Its shadow filled the room, huge and terrible. Holmes's hand found mine in the darkness. He pressed something cold and heavy into my palm, the last thermos of burning brandy, its cap already loosened. "Fire, Watson," he whispered. "It is the only thing it still fears." The creature lunged. I hurled the flask with all my strength. It struck the thing full in the face and burst in a blossom of blue flame. Alcohol and burning spirit poured down the torso, igniting the dry ice vapor that still clung to it. The roar that followed was beyond anything human. Frost staggered back, beating at the flames that now crawled across the wires, the tubes, the dead flesh. The galvanic battery exploded in a shower of sparks. Bottles of chemicals shattered in the heat. The air filled with choking, hellish fumes. Holmes dragged me backward into the lane. Behind us, the laboratory became a furnace. Flames licked up the walls, melting the ice, consuming the work of years. Through the open door, we saw the creature one last time. Standing in the heart of the fire, arms outstretched as though embracing the only warmth it would ever know again. Then the roof fell in. A blast of superheated air hurled us into the snow. When we raised our heads, number 13 Erebus Lane was a pyre. Orange light painted the falling snowflakes gold. The heat was so intense that the snow around the house melted in a perfect circle, exposing the black earth beneath. Somewhere inside, a single fading scream and silence. Fire brigades came clanging through the streets, far too late. By the time the pumps were brought to bear, only the foundations remained, glowing red in the dawn. Of Nathaniel Frost, of Jacob Grimes, of the horrors they had wrought together, nothing remained but a puddle of dark water already freezing again into black ice. Holmes stood bareheaded in the snow, watching the smoke rise. "Thus perished the Frosts," he said at last, "in fire and in ice, a fitting epilogue." He turned away. The bells of St. Paul's were ringing for Christmas morning service, sweet and clear across the ruined city. We walked back toward the river without speaking. The Thames flowed on beneath its shell of ice, carrying the new day downstream toward the sea. Behind us the fire died to embers and the snow began to cover even those. Chapter 10. The Deduction in the Warm. The great frost still held London in its fist, but the sky had cleared to a hard porcelain blue, and the sun, though it gave no heat, struck dazzling fire from every icicle and every pane of glass. Baker Street was almost deserted. Only the muffin man and a few hardy crossing sweepers braved the cold. When we climbed the 17 steps to our old sitting room, the fire was roaring, the kettle singing, and Mrs. Hudson had laid out a breakfast that would have fed a regiment. Deviled kidneys, eggs, toast thick with butter, and a pot of coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Holmes flung himself into his armchair, still in his ulster, frost glittering on the shoulders like diamond dust. I poured coffee with hands that still trembled slightly from the night's events. For a long while, neither of us spoke. The silence was comfortable, almost sacred, the silence of men who have looked into the pit and walked away. At last, Holmes stretched his long legs toward the blaze and began to fill his oldest clay pipe. "Well, Watson," he said, "you have your tin box and your sensational vocabulary. How will you write this one?" I set down my cup. "I shall not write it at all, Holmes. Some things are too terrible for the public prints." He gave a short, approving nod. "Wise. Yet between ourselves the chain must be laid out plainly, lest memory distort it. Let us have the deduction while the facts are fresh." He puffed once, twice, then began in that quiet, precise voice I had come to love. "First principle. When a man is found murdered in untouched snow, with no footprints save his own, the mind leaps to the impossible. We eliminate the impossible, remember. What remained was merely improbable. The sledge across hard ice was always the only physical explanation. Once we discovered the Norwegian pulk in the laboratory, the method was clear. Second, the nature of the wound. No human arm could tear a throat in that fashion without a blade, yet no blade was used. The marks were of fingernails and teeth. Post-mortem tissue is rigid, Watson, and the revived Frost possessed abnormal strength. He embraced his brother in the dark, believing him an hallucination or an angel of release. The carotid was torn by the convulsive pressure of arms that no longer knew their own power. Third, the red herrings, Miss Lavinia's earring, torn from her ear when she searched the park on the 22nd and stumbled upon the creature in the snow. She lost consciousness. It fled. Dr. Heller's rats and his Faustian pretensions, mere scientific vanity. He revived drowned cats in Vienna, nothing more. The real galvanic work was Frost's own. Fourth, Jacob Grimes, the faithful dog to the end. He had driven the sledge for his master in life. He drove it in death. When Frost escaped the laboratory, Grimes followed with the remaining huskies, trying to bring him home to the cold that preserved him. The dogs that were found torn apart in the park were not victims of a werewolf. They were food for a master who could no longer digest anything but living heat. Holmes paused, staring into the fire. Fifth and last, the final fire. Dry ice, alcohol vapor, and a spark from the ruptured battery. There was never any hope of saving the building once the flames took hold. Perhaps it was mercy. Nathaniel Frost died twice, once on his own table, once in honest fire. Few men are granted such choice of endings. He knocked out his pipe against the grate. The official record will read Elias Frost murdered by person or persons unknown. Nathaniel Frost and servant Jacob Grimes perished in accidental conflagration at Erebus Lane. Lestrade is content. The yard is spared embarrassment, and the public sleeps easier believing in vampires rather than in what men may do to themselves in the name of science. I refilled our cups. And the moral, Holmes? He smiled, a wintry, tired smile. That there are doors, Watson, which should remain locked. Death is not a rival to be conquered. It is a frontier to be respected. The Greeks knew it. Hubris invites nemesis. We saw nemesis last night, clothed in frost and fire. He rose and went to the window. Children were skating on the pond in Regent's Park. Their shouts came faintly through the glass. Observe, he said softly. Life goes on. The world forgets quickly. By Easter, this frost will be a tale to frighten children. And by next Christmas only we shall remember what walked beneath the moon. I joined him at the window. The sun was higher now, striking long shadows across the snow. Will you ever speak of it again? I asked. Only to you, old friend, and only on nights when the wind howls and the snow lies deep. He turned back to the fire and lifted his glass of whiskey. Mrs. Hudson had left a decanter for medicinal purposes. 2 absent brothers, he said, and to the mercy of closed doors. We drank. Outside, the church bells began to ring the hour, clear silver notes across a city that had almost lost one of its oldest certainties. The fire crackled. The kettle sang again. The familiar clutter of 221B surrounded us like armor. I have kept my promise. I have never published this story. Yet tonight, 37 years later, as another great frost grips London and the wind moans in the chimney like a voice from the grave, I take up my pen at last. If you, dear reader, chance to read these words on some future Christmas Eve when the snow falls thick and the fire burns low, draw your chair a little closer and heap the coals higher. Some doors are locked for a reason, and some keys once turned can never be turned back.